Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of Novel Approaches with me, Claire Bucknell. Today is an especially novel approach to our series because we aren't in fact discussing a novel per se, but a verse novel. A long poem, a little longer than Paradise Lost, I think, if you're counting, that tells a novel-like story and which was recognised by contemporaries as resembling a novel or having novel-like features. Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning was published in 1856 and greatly admired by Ruskin, Swinburne and Wilde. And to talk about it, I'm delighted to be joined by Stephanie Markowitz, who teaches English at Yale and has published widely on literature of the Romantic and Victorian periods and on the verse novel in particular, and Seamus Perry, who teaches English at Oxford and whom many of you will know from his Close Readings series with Mark Ford. Stephanie and Seamus, thank you both very much for joining me.
Lovely to be here.
Nice to be here.
I thought we might begin with a letter that Barrett Browning wrote to her friend, Mary Russell Mitford, in 1844, when she was first sketching the outlines of what would become Aurora Leigh, because I think it gives us just a sense of the extraordinary ambition that she had for her work, her own awareness of the boundaries that she would be breaking by writing it. And she says, "People care for a story, that's the truth. And I, who care so much for stories, am not to find fault with them. And now tell me, where is the obstacle to making as interesting a story of a poem as of a prose work? Echo answers, where? Conversations and events, why may they not be given as rapidly and passionately and lucidly in verse as in prose? Echo answers, why? And then she goes on and she says that she wants to touch this real everyday life of our age and hold it with my two hands. I want to write a poem of a new class, a Don Juan without the mockery and impurity, under one aspect, and having unity and admitting of as much philosophical dreaming and digression, which is in fact a characteristic of the age, as I like to use. Might it not be done, even if I could not do it, and I think of trying at any rate." So, okay, Aurora Leigh is to be a work of a new class, in blank verse, so a poem, but telling this long story set in the present and about real life, so in that respect more like a novel. And it's to have this story that's going to unfold rapidly and passionately and lucidly, so like a real page-turner, but with these sort of Byronic-esque interludes of dreaming and digression, these pauses and diversions. So a tricky thing to pull off. So in a moment, we'll take a closer look at the shape of the work and its sort of hybrid nature. First, can I ask you, Seamus, to tell us a little about Barrett Browning? So who she was, this woman poet in an age generally still suspicious of women poets, who was driven to write this super ambitious modern epic.
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that she was probably the most successful Victorian woman poet. Her modern reputation sank a bit in the 20th century, I think, and Christina Rossetti kind of took the pole position, and obviously Emily Dickinson as well. But certainly for Victorian readers of the 1850s and 60s, she's a superstar and very, very widely admired, not just by Ruskin, as you say, but Tennyson admires her, Wordsworth admires her, George Eliot admires her. And then into the 20th century, we might come on to this later on, but into the 20th century, people like Woolf are also singling her out, not just as an exemplary kind of precursor, as a woman artist, literary artist, but also as a great writer in her own right. She's born Elizabeth Barrett into a pretty wealthy family, what sounds, whenever she describes it, as an idyllic childhood in the countryside in Herefordshire. Her father's money all comes from big plantations in the West Indies, something of which she's very acutely aware in her later life. Her own politics become very quickly established as progressive and liberal. She's a prodigy. She reads phenomenally. She starts publishing poetry not just in magazines, but also in slim volumes when she's still young. The family moved to London, to the famous address, 50 Wimpole Street. And in a way, it's the archetypal narrative that becomes so attractive that there's a very successful play made of it, and then 2 Hollywood films are made of it. And it's about her debilitating sickness. She's confined to the house. She's a kind of almost extreme representation of a certain kind of Victorian female archetype, kept away from the world in confined space. And then there's this extraordinary narrative of emancipation and liberation that happens when Robert Browning turns up. And they leave not just, as it were, the confined spaces of Wimpole Street, but the confined spaces of England, and discover, the outside world in Europe, in Italy. And that's where she writes Aurora Leigh.
Yeah, so tell me about her writing. Where does Aurora Leigh fit into her literary career? And what are the immediate influences and context of its composition?
Well, I think it's one of those poems a bit like Tennyson's In Memoriam or something like that, that is an act of quite self-conscious self-definition. It's a poet trying to figure out what it is that she's doing, what female creativity means, how creativity fits within a political agenda or a set of passionately held political beliefs about liberation and liberalism broadly conceived. So it's a very self-defining poem in that sense. I think perhaps better than the In Memoriam is the Prelude is a good example of the kind of poem that it is. A poem that exists partly to define the kind of poetry that it has discovered itself to be in the process of coming into existence. Picking up on the things you said in your introduction, Claire, she wants to write what she calls a sort of novel poem for a long time. And I think that is one of the defining qualities of mid-19th century English poetry, this acute sense that there is a new kid on the block, and it's called the novel. And how do you cope with this? Well, if you're Matthew Arnold, as it were, you rush back into the arms of a belated kind of classicizing poetic imagination. But other poets respond to it in different ways. There's a brilliant essay that Clough, Arnold's friend, writes about his volume of 1853, where he says, it's obvious that people prefer Vanity Fair and Bleak House. That's what they want. Why can't we get some of that into poetry? And Clough has his own attempt at doing that, which isn't much like Aurora Leigh, but it's an attempt to get the rhythms and the patterns of modern speech into verse. The influences and the other bits and pieces that are at stake in it are many. I think one of the things she wants to do is to write something that's self-consciously modern. So she wants to write a poem. I think this is the aspect of the poem I most enjoy, really. She wants to write a poem in which you can have phrases like, the train swept us on. Trains are always a great marker of modernity in mid-Victorian literary art of all kinds. But not just things like that. Also, she wants to get in there phrases like, here's the point, and well, and in truth, that kind of register that, you can look in vain for that in the Prelude. You won't find things like that. The Prelude pitches itself a bit higher than that. And I suppose the other things to say about the background of the poem, we know, don't we, because it's cited in the chit-chat of the urbane classes in Book 5 of the poem, that one of the issues that everyone chatters about in drawing room parties is what Barrett Browning called the woman's question. So it is absolutely addressing a current issue. The sort of thing, actually, that Tennyson has attempted to address in a poem of 1847 called The Princess, though in a very ambivalent and not altogether kind of satisfying way. So I think there's something about that. And also, the last thing I'd say is that she has a very progressive and interested, emancipatory political agenda, but she also knows what she doesn't want, and that is what she calls socialism. She thinks that there's a certain kind of abstract or theoretical kind of emancipatory politics that's out there, and she doesn't think that that's the answer. And that's also something else that she tries to communicate in her poem.
Okay, so yes, I think we'll come to that when we take a look at book 2. Stephanie, let's come to the plot. I mean, plot sometimes feels a funny word when talking about a poem, but this is a novel poem and it definitely has a plot or many plots. Could you give us a sense of that and perhaps also of the key characters, figures in Aurora Leigh?
Sure, and I do think plot is really important to how this poem makes its meaning. She herself called it an autobiography of a poetess, not me, is her term for it, in addition to a novel poem. We can question how much Aurora is like and unlike Elizabeth herself. But the verse novel unfolds, or I'm almost tempted to say gestates, over 9 books. And it's both a Bildungsroman, like David Copperfield, which traces the arc from childhood to maturity of its namesake protagonist, and also, and in this it's also like David Copperfield, it's a Künstlerroman, a portrait of the artist. The thing that's different from a book like David Copperfield, or for that matter, from a book like The Prelude, which it also resembles in both these regards, is its heroine, Aurora. And both her gender and her nationality are, I think, among the features that make this a really distinct work. Aurora is a kind of hybrid in and of herself. She's born in Italy to an English expat father and Italian mother who died when she was 4, and the first book relates both this loss and that subsequent loss of her rather bookish father when she's 13. These are the events that precipitate her return to England and into her aunt's care. This aunt attempts to instruct her rather recalcitrant niece in conventional womanliness, and in England she also meets her neighbor and cousin, Romney Leigh, who is a committed political activist in a Christian socialist vein, and so that's where this anti-socialist plot that Seamus was talking about enters in, whose offer of marriage she rejects in Book 2, and she rejects it in order rather to follow her artistic ambitions. The proposal is framed very much as a debate between her art and his social activism as to which of the two is going to be the most productive socially. On her aunt's death, Aurora moves to London, and much of what follows traces alternately her development and rising fame as an artist. And in that sense, and I think, again, this is something that Seamus suggested, she's not only the narrator, but also, in a way, the author of the work that we're reading. And then the other plot line is much more novelistically conventional, and in fact, it resembles that of a novel like Jane Austen's Emma or even Pride and Prejudice. And that is that we trace the dawning recognition of Aurora's love for Romney. The latter plot is fed somewhat sensationally, we might say, by two rivals for his heart, although rivals is a complicated term here, whom we meet in Book 3 of the verse novel. One is the wealthy and cosmopolitan widow, Lady Waldemar, and the other is the poor seamstress Marian, who is the abandoned daughter of a somewhat drunken, rural, itinerant worker, and to whom Romney actually engages himself in an effort, we might say, to live out his politics. Marian fails to show at the wedding, which is this odd scene in which, I believe we'll turn to it later, but in which we see the classes both enter into this same church. She doesn't show up. She rather disappears somewhat mysteriously from the scene. And then there's a temporal gap, and the timing of the plot is complicated. The timing of narration is complicated. But a year and a half later, we find Aurora, a successful writer in London. She goes to an evening party and discovers that there are rumors about that Lady Waldemar will, in fact, be marrying Romney. She doesn't really confront her feelings, but rather decides to just give up, to leave the field to Lady Waldemar, whom she really detests. The poem's quite clear about that, by escaping London and returning to Italy. And this decision occupies most of Book 5 of the poem, which is in many ways its pivot. And it's also the place where Aurora most clearly articulates her ars poetica. And it's worth just remarking that the verse novel has something of a ring structure, with discernible parallels to be found between books 1 and 9, between books 2 and 8, and so forth, and 5's right at the center there. So what that means is that after Book 5, we start in some ways to retrace our steps. But in addition to encountering the mysteries of her own heart, both Aurora and the reader labor under various mysteries in the plot after her return to the continent. In Paris, we learn, alongside Aurora, how Marian has been convinced not to marry by Lady Waldemar, and how, thinking that she was being offered the chance to immigrate along with Lady Waldemar's maid, she was instead, I want to say, trafficked by her, raped, and then abandoned. And she's now given birth to a son in Paris. Aurora offers Marian and the child a home in Italy, where the two women and the baby boy travel together to Italy. And this is where the train journey comes in some extraordinary passages of poetry. That journey is described. And it's only after some time spent back in Florence, where she's kind of avoiding and misreading the various communications from England that come her way, that Romney's return to Italy, or rather his arrival in Italy in Book 7, first, I want to say, muddies and then clarifies what's happened in her absence. And what we eventually learn is that Leigh Hall, the ancestral home, which he tried to convert into a kind of socialist commune, has been burnt to the ground. And rather like Rochester in Jane Eyre, and there are a lot of echoes here with Bronte's novel, which, by the way, Elizabeth Barrett Browning did not like, but was clearly influenced by, Romney's been blinded in the fire. He's also, surprise, surprise, in his blindness come to see the light regarding Aurora's poetic ambitions. And there's a lot of confusion that's generated in these books by Romney's belief that she's already been told this news, and by Aurora's own misreading of the events. She thinks that the news that Romney is bringing is the news of his marriage to Lady Waldemar. At first, it appears that he's come to propose to Marian, and in fact, he does that. He wants to claim her and the baby as his own, but Marian rejects him. And then in the end of the poem, largely by retreading the argumentative ground of their first proposal scene in the garden in England, matters are eventually clarified. Romney and Aurora agree to marry. It's hard to say who proposes to whom in this scene, because, as Aurora puts it, and this is a much debated line, art is much, but love is more. And the poem finally concludes with Aurora's narrated description of the dawn after which she has been christened, to Romney, who of course can't see it himself, and to us. And she narrates it as a vision of the New Jerusalem. And that's where we end.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast, or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.